Colleagues, welcome. Thank you very much for coming out on what's turned out to be a rather cold winter evening. And thank you in particular for coming out, even though, unfortunately, the minister, or his PA, emailed us this morning to say that he's fallen ill and was unable to be here, despite having a captive audience. So we're going to proceed regardless, because I think the issues, some of you got the captive joke, the issues are nonetheless, I think, extremely important, and I think we have a really good panel that's going to give you all stuff to think about, but it also means that without the protocols, without the minister and all the rest of the stuff that we normally have to go through, there's much more time for you to be able to ask questions, and that's really where we want to try and get to as quickly as we can. So hurry these speakers along. I'm told for anyone younger than me, if you want to, you can tweet on hashtag RET debate. I don't know what that means, but I'm sure it'll make you very happy. I don't know how you do those things. Let me say also, while the minister is not here, that also means that the European Union is not funding this event. They were on the invite, but they only fund government to government, and they asked us to put in the disclaimer in case this becomes something that they would not necessarily be part of. But let me please start by acknowledging some important guests that are in the audience. We're very honored in this school to have, as a visiting research fellow, the former Speaker of the National Assembly, Max Sisulu. We're also joined by former Finance Minister, Mr. Trevor Manuel, and from the Oliver and Adelaide Foundation, we have the grandchildren, Zachary and Theodora Tambo, who have also joined us this evening. So thank you to them. We will have a couple of words about the OR Tambo Foundation in a second, but so you understand, these debates are hosted by a partnership between the Wits School of Governance, the OR Tambo Foundation, the United Nations Development Programme, the UNDP, and the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation. And I think what we try and do in these debates is pay tribute to OR Tambo's attributes as a social justice advocate, a strategic thinker, and particularly a debater. Someone who's not afraid of being confronted with things he doesn't agree with and takes them on as they are and deals with them. And I'm hoping that's what part of what will come out of this evening. I think the UNDP is important for playing a crucial role in providing technical knowledge and expertise by bringing international best practice perspectives and support for this series and for government as a whole. The DPME, of course, plays a vital role in ensuring that recommendations and other outcomes of this series of debates, are adequately considered in policy-making circles of government. And it'll be interesting to see what happens tonight and what that does to radical economic transformation. I think the point that we're trying to make is that these debates that we host are not done just for the sake of it. They're normally anchored in the National Development Plan. Well, they're not normally, they are anchored there. And the point is to say, are we following the NDP at all? And the question we were asking tonight is, how does radical economic transformation relate to the NDP? Does it at all relate to the NDP? Does the NDP make any nod in the direction of radical economic transformation, or are they poles apart? And these are merely questions meant to try and get you thinking, but I think that's really the critical angle we come from. And let me say very clearly, when I say critical, I mean it in the best possible sense. The fact that the minister fell ill meant that we simply carried on. This is a university, we're here to debate, we're here to engage. We'll obey some rules of courtesy and asking brief questions. But beyond that, the floor will be open, and anyone who catches my eye will be invited to speak. So please do sit back and enjoy. I'm going to start by asking Mr. Duma Nkosi, the former mayor of Ekurhuleni, if he would come up and say a couple of words about the Tambo Foundation.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe the first point one would like to raise, just to say, as a member of the party of Oliver Tambo, the situation I'm in now will be largely a bit uncertain, a bit conflictual, and I would be seeing a bit of disunity. I hope it makes sense. But on the other side, I think coming here today, we are the Oliver and Adelaide Tambo Foundation. because I could see that lots of colleagues refer to O.R. Tambo Foundation. The emphasis of being able to look at the couple and maybe both comrades, to put it correctly, is that they actually played significant role. Both of them, for the city of Ekurhuleni, they have been actually given the freedom of the city of Ekurhuleni, both Oliver and Adelaide Tambo, as well as Chris Hani. They are free people of the city of Ekurhuleni. We have taken a view as the foundation to look at this year as 2017, 100 years. Birthday is 27 October this year. Earlier on in the morning today, we had a countdown from 100, looking at the birthday. SABC had 4 national radio stations, looking at a point of who is it that we're talking about. So the foundation has confirmed the theme, which reads, "On the Shoulders of a Giant." And on our part, we think we should be able, this year particularly, because it's his centenary year, to honor the legacy, but we want to confirm that it's of a seminal figure in the history of the liberation struggle of South Africa, hoping that we can be able to actually express ourselves to the immense contributions to the ANC particularly, and the establishment of our democracy. We're hoping that we can be able to record, share, and have same understanding of the kind of role he played. We're hoping that we can be able to document and learn from values, skills, and practices of Tambo's work life. And on our side, we still believe all those principles, skills, or practices are still relevant today. We hope to use the legacy to stimulate debate, research, education, and action that can help us resolve the long-standing challenges we face as a country. Socio-economic upliftment and education of the youth and women, and the promotion of arts and culture and heritage initiatives. We're hoping that we can be able to do that. Program Director, I think as a person, we were trying to get words together to explain on how we see him, or we saw him as a person. We see him as a person that was serving, selfless, a person that did a lot of sacrifice. It's a person with huge personal integrity, honest, a person with mutual respect, a person who has humility. We know there's a lot of Christian principle that drove him, but we know that has helped him to be able to be responsible and responsive. Further, we think he did like the internal debates. We also understand that he did criticize and self-criticize. But what we know very well is that he was able to listen and ready to engage in a way of finding solution to challenges that he was facing. But further, I think for all of us, he has been a person who was very focused in ensuring that there's unity and collective leadership. I think in few words, just to explain on how we see him, we think we can say without contradiction that he was visionary. We can say he was an internationalist and also strategic. We are actually able to confirm as well that he was a leader that was open and approachable, exemplary, and led from the front. Serious hard worker. The last point, Program Director, one would like to raise just to say I actually tried to get very good English words. He was unequivocal in the repudiation of any form of factionalism, corruption, patronage, and greed. How does that sound?
Thank you very much. Theodora, you were acknowledged before you arrived, and I'll do it again now that you have arrived, so welcome. Colleagues, I'm going to do protocol very quickly because we don't have to do lots of protocol because the minister's not here. So let me quickly introduce the panel, and then we're going to go. Okay, so first up we're going to have Professor Pandi Pillay, who wrote the background paper, which I hope you all received on the email, those of you who RSVP'd. In that paper, you'll see my name's attached to it, so all the good bits I wrote, and the rest of it Pandi wrote, fairly obviously. He's our senior professor of economics and public finance here at the school. He was previously head of the policy unit in the Office of the President and executive director of the Financial and Fiscal Commission. He's published widely. He's worked in Bangladesh, Egypt, Kenya, Iran, Lesotho, Namibia, Nigeria, Pakistan, Rwanda, Uganda, and Zambia. And got his PhD from, gosh, an obscure university somewhere in the other end of this country. I shan't, never mind. I can't read, I'm battling. Duma, can you help me? Cape Town, I think that says. Next up is my boss, but not for tonight. The Dean, Professor Imran Valodia, who's the Dean of the CLM faculty, that's Commerce, Law and Management. He's a well-known economist. I'm not sure if that's a compliment or not. And works on competition policy in the Competition Tribunal. He's led and participated in a number of large national and international studies. You probably know him better at the moment. He was appointed by Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa to chair the advisory panel that developed the proposal for a national minimum wage last year. And you'd have seen Imran all over the TV. I would like to note, please, that there are 2 women on the panel, and there were 3 when we set it up. The third was called to London on a business meeting, a private sector. I mean, she was representing business. So I'd just like to note the gender point. So my colleague, Dr. Karen Abrams, is a senior lecturer here at the School of Governance. Before joining us here, she was at the Gauteng City Region Observatory, where she focused on social cohesion, anti-racism, urban inclusion, and urban food systems in Gauteng. She's published on most of those topics as well, and she's got a PhD from the University of Edinburgh. Dr. Niva Mekhetla over there, about whom I'm going to say one thing that she hates me saying, because her twin sister did tell me. She got into Harvard when she was 16. Woo! I show off on my panelists' behalf in the hope that they do me favors later. Niva's a senior economist at the Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies. In other words, she is a senior person at TIPS, put it that way. She used to be DDG in economic policy in the Economic Development Department from 2010 to 2014. And before that, she worked for the Presidency, the DBSA, and COSATU, as well as various other government departments. Before 1994, she worked in various universities in Africa and in the United States. Her research centers on aspects of industrial policy and value chain analysis, and on socioeconomic challenges facing South Africa, especially around employment creation and inequality. So there you have the formalities. What we'll do is Pandi will talk and basically talk to the background paper, after which each of the panelists will have 10 minutes max, and I'm going to be rather fascist about that, to do their inputs. If there are any questions, particularly those framing questions that haven't been answered, I may ask a couple of questions of them, and then it'll be over to you. Okay? Does that sound fair? Pandi, it's all yours.
It's working? Thank you very much and good evening. I was comfortably sitting on the substitutes bench and was pulled off that bench when the minister pulled out. So I'm not I'm not part of this really auspicious team here. I just brought on as a substitute, but be that as it may. I'd like to begin with the point that I make in the paper, that how far South Africa has moved in altering the economic landscape is quite open to debate. I think no one will disagree that it has certainly moved, but the important questions are how far has it moved, at what speed has it moved, and at what point will the monopolistic tendencies in the South African economy be challenged. And this seems to me to be a very key point of the debate. But it is equally pertinent to ask, I think, at this point in time, if the policy emphasis on economic growth has been misplaced. The implicit assumption here being that if the economy grew at a sufficiently high rate, it would somehow take care of the psychosocial impact of racism, violence, and spatial dislocation created by apartheid. I think it would be dishonest to deny that much has been achieved in many areas. Meeting basic needs, mechanisms for enhancing social cohesion, and so on. But a notable omission, in my opinion, in the list of developmental successes relates to the post-1994 economy. For the democratic period as a whole, economic growth has been singularly anemic. Unemployment has been rising consistently. Income inequality has been worsening. But poverty alleviation, to some extent, has been addressed, certainly on the most conservative measures of $1 and $2 a day. And I think the relative lack of progress on the economy has occurred in spite of a plethora of national policy documents, the most recent of which, as you know, has been the National Development Plan. Now, this National Development Plan, again, as you know, was greeted with great enthusiasm in various quarters, not least in the private business sector, both by old South African capital and newly empowered capital. I prefer to use old and new rather than colors. However, it is the content and the projections of the National Development Plan that are hugely problematic, especially with regard to economic policy. Now, if you look at the present time where growth is at an all-time low and unemployment at an all-time high, the NDP might actually appear to be quite a radical document. However, the real crisis in South Africa at the present time are somewhat obscured by the political crises of recent months. And this political crisis, in my opinion, has provided an opportunity, amongst other things, for mainstream economists to reinforce the need for fiscal discipline, quote unquote, as if that is the only factor stifling growth and development in our country. In business and in some parts of government, economic policy is essentially reduced to the maintenance of macroeconomic stability. Fiscal discipline, and I would add political stability, are clearly important preconditions for economic growth, but they are clearly not enough. One of the really important questions that needs to be addressed in the debate about economic transformation is the question of who is in charge of economic policy in this country. For me, it has been evident for some time that the private business sector in South Africa leads on economic policy and the government follows. And I think it is clearly time for government to reverse this and to take charge of economic policy, including macroeconomic policy, so that the country's real development needs can be addressed. Achieving growth rates of 2 to 3% which seems to be the limit of our ambitions at the moment, may be adequate for the private business sector and the top 10% of the South African population. But it will not deliver higher levels of more inclusive growth to address the important challenges of unemployment, inequality, and poverty. In fact, growth of such modest proportions will serve to accentuate inequalities in the country, with the rich yet again apportioning to themselves a highly disproportionate share of the fruits of economic growth. At the same time, I would like to add that if radical economic transformation is to serve the needs of the bottom 60% of the population, it really needs to move beyond the catchy and convenient political slogans of nationalizing land, banks, and mines, and kicking out white people. It requires indeed a rigorous analysis of why economic and social policy have not delivered growth and development. And in the paper, we set out some ideas on how we can attempt to build a more equitable and inclusive society. And I will briefly discuss these 5 or 6 points. The first is to reiterate the point that government must take charge of economic policy. And I think it's really important to reiterate and reinforce the point that government must take charge of economic policy rather than being subservient to the private business sector, the credit rating agencies, the World Bank, and the IMF. Secondly, I think there's an urgent need to expand industrial policy. Industrial development, as we know, is a key driver of economic development because it is considered as a solution to overcome, amongst other things, commodity dependence. Now, in spite of being a late starter on industrial policy, much progress has been made already in this regard. However, much more can be done with increased funding for much needed growth and greater diversification of the manufacturing sector. Thirdly, there is the notion of how can we develop small business. Almost everyone agrees that small business has to be a critical component of any development strategy. However, as we know, this sector has been characterized by a singular lack of success in terms of either sustainability or employment. We need to move away from this widely accepted notion that the most important challenge to the development of small business is government funding or lack of it. Rather, we should ask why so many small businesses are failing in spite of considerable funding by the IDC and other institutions. It seems to me that a much more important issue here is the exploitation of the small business sector by big business. One needs only to examine the history of the large supermarkets and their ruthless exploitation of small suppliers, as recent investigations have demonstrated, and the differential treatment of large and small businesses by shopping mall owners, to get a sense of the highly unequal and hugely exploitative relationships that currently exist in virtually all sectors of the economy. Under these circumstances, it's incredibly difficult to ensure the development of small business. Fourthly, breaking up monopolies and cartels. As is well known, the South African economy is characterized by the excessive concentration of economic power in the hands of a tiny minority of the population. Large conglomerates now dominate production, distribution, and the financial sectors. In addition, there's a high degree of monopolization and blatant anti-competitive tendencies, such as predatory pricing and interlocking directorships. However, and very fortunately, one of the most progressive features of South African economic policy post-1994 has been the development of the competition architecture, comprising in particular legislation that established the Competition Commission and the Competition Tribunal. Sterling work has been done by these institutions to expose collusion, particularly with respect to price setting. But we know that the Commission and the Tribunal are seriously underfunded. Much more funding is needed here to provide these institutions with the resources that they need. Fifthly, ensuring real black economic empowerment. It goes without saying that black economic empowerment needs to progress beyond the elite few who are closely linked to the ruling party. Sectors such as tourism provide opportunities for creative thinking about new forms of ownership that are more innovative and beneficial to a greater proportion of the previously disadvantaged population. Sixth, building the developmental state. Given the current political climate, there's a great deal of skepticism about the potential of the developmental state, particularly in the light of the pervasive governance and fiscal crisis afflicting important parastatals such as ESCOM, SAA, SABC, DENEL, etc., to mention a few. However, there is no alternative to the developmental state. We cannot leave economic development to the South African private business sector, whose immense wealth has been built on the misplaced notion of the free market and the exploitation of cheap labor. This is the only model that South African capitalism knows. For the developmental state to be effective, however, it has to be competent. Or in the language of the NDP, it has to be capable. And there is much to be learned also from the international experience on the developmental state, and it is important that South Africa to absorb these lessons, whether they are from Asia, Scandinavia, or Latin America. Now, in conclusion, what we see in South Africa at the present time is an obsession on the part of both the private sector and the government with macroeconomic stability, which is adopted almost universally as an article of faith. Such economics will undoubtedly provide the 2 to 3% growth rates that these constituencies strive for. But it will not deliver growth of the magnitude and type that is needed to address South Africa's developmental challenges. At the same time, building the developmental state does not imply a return to yesterday's socialism of state control of the means of production. Rather, we should focus on an appropriate mix of roles for the state and the business sector, with the state as the driver of development, coupled with truly competitive markets producing goods and services. Radical economic transformation is more than just political posturing on issues such as white monopoly capital. Rather, it should be about addressing the real challenges of sustained growth and development. Thank you.
Thank you, Pandi. I'm not going to jump up before each speaker. I just wanted to flesh out a couple of the framing questions, which are in the paper, but we've added a few because we didn't get them all down on the first time. So one of them is obviously what's radical in radical economic transformation? How do you define the radical? What does it mean? What are the component parts of it? How do we make the move from where we are, which is stagnation, recession, into a radically transformed economy? You can't say we will do that through RET if you're not able to define what RET is and what the components are that will move you from one place to another. So what are the elements of that radicalism that will actually help us make that jump? I don't think anyone is really arguing that we don't need some kind of change. And I think it's important that in the current political mess that we're in should not obscure the importance of the need for radical economic transformation. And I think the danger of it is that it's so associated with the current very unpleasant politics, is that the whole notion of radical economic transformation is liable to be seen as the product of one part of the ANC, and therefore it can be labeled and put away and ignored, and it can be business as usual elsewhere. I think we have to de-link it from the party politics at the moment. I think there is also the broader question that we are heading into, we keep getting told, the next industrial revolution, in which there will be no more blue-collar jobs, there'll be no more white-collar jobs, there'll only be what they call new-collar jobs, which is, economists speak for, we've got no idea if anyone will have a job, but with automation and the rest taking over, you really have to worry that we're still stuck in a mindset of extractive industries and industrialization, and automation is taking over. What is going to happen to the already staggering level of unemployment that we're suffering from? And very finally, the point that we alluded to in the paper, which is, can you really talk about radical economic transformation in isolation from radical spatial transformation? It's still a 24-kilometer drive from here to the center of Soweto. It doesn't matter how you play the game. You're still locked in racially, not entirely racially, but very largely racially defined areas that apartheid created for us. And people still live there in the same communities they did before. Some of the more affluent may be deracializing, but the poor sure ain't. So what do you do about that? Even if we got 10% growth and lots of jobs, is it really going to transform the townships? And if it doesn't, what are we doing to break those barriers? The barriers are there by design. The highway between us and Soweto, it's not accidental. It was designed to keep them away from us. Remember, I mean, that's the whole point of spatial segregation. And then we've got the, can you do economic and spatial without dealing with radical social transformation? Look at the intensity of the racial debate right now. Look at the way in which everything is immediately racialized. Whether it deserves to be or not is up to you. But the intensity of that debate tells us that we have not moved anywhere near far enough to even acknowledging the problem, let alone finding the solution. And we tend to think if the economy works and people get jobs and their dignity is somehow restored, social stuff will kind of follow. Well, I think these few inches here are not being fixed by economic change or the lack of. It needs this space here. It needs particular attention that is not going to be solved by economic means. And so this will all be sorted out now by our last three panelists in remarkably short time. So we'll start with Imran, go on to Karen, and end with Neva.
Okay, so so my task was to kind of respond to the minister's talk, and it's a little hard to do that when the person's not in the room and you're not sure what he said. So let me start with a few thoughts to just frame things. Firstly, I want to make quite clear that as far as I'm concerned, all of this talk, the way that the RET sort of conversations being had by certain parts of the sort of country, and that goes all the way to the head of the state, is nothing but an excuse to loot. And I think we have to be absolutely clear about that. Kind of having said that, I do think that there is a kind of need for us to kind of radically rethink what type of economic program we should have. And I say that because for many of us who were thinking about what the post-apartheid economy would look like in the 1980s and the kind of early 90s, I think the country that we had in our mind that we thought we were building was something that was might be aligned with Sweden. So we were thinking we were going to sort of build a social democratic country where we would have consensus, where we would have growth, where we would increase our exports, and that was the vision in our minds. And I think if we don't start to deal with some of the problems, it's likely that we might end up like the DRC. And I don't say that the kind of DRC to kind of demean what the DRC is like, but I think we could end up being a sort of country where we sort of fighting for resources, and we caught up in sort of battles that are not going to get us kind of out of the problems that we have. So for me, any policy around kind of radical economic transformation, I think has to deal with two things. And I disagree with sort of Pandi on the first point. I think economic growth has to be at the kind of absolute center of anything that we're going to do from here on. So I kind of think his paper underplays that, and I think it has to be at the kind of at the forefront of it. But I think that kind of economic growth has to deal with two real issues, and that's firstly that we've got to deal with the levels of inequality in our the path that we're on has generated increasing inequality, and I think we have to deal with that. And I think we've got to deal with the ownership issue. And for me, those two issues have to be the way that we transform the economy to get us onto a new growth path where we're going to get the sorts of economic growth rates that we should. So that is all like a, you might say, who doesn't want economic growth? So let me share with you three kind of broad sets of ideas about how I think we could get to growth that would deal with the kind of problems of ownership, and which could deal with the problems of inequality. So my first set of thoughts is kind of related to the state and to government. And I think here again, maybe Pandi and I are not quite on the same page. I think we talk a lot about white monopoly capital. I think it's about time we start we start talking about the problems of state monopoly capital. Let me give you two examples. I think what Eskom is doing to us is something that we should be completely furious about. What Eskom's doing is to take our money and throw it down the tubes. I think it's about time we confronted the fact, and I think it's the perfect time to do it. So if I were the finance minister, I think the first thing I would do is stop thinking. I'd be here in the first case. The first thing I'd do is to start rethinking the whole question. The whole question of state-owned enterprises. I think Eskom has to be broken up. You can't have a large power utility such as the one that we have that deals with with both the generation of power and also the transmission of power. We have to break those two up. And that's because ESCOM, in that setting, kind of all of its incentives are to look after itself and to not deal with what we need in the energy space. Let's take another example, SAA. We pouring billions into SAA. I can't understand what's the reason for SAA to be owned by the state and why we should continue to subsidize it. You kind of hear the argument that we need a state-owned airline because a private airline isn't going to fly some routes which we have to have flown. Well, what we have with SAA doesn't fly between Durban and Cape Town. It doesn't fly between the second and the third largest cities within South Africa. What is the argument for us to pour money into SA? So I think we've got to really think about what's the role of state-owned enterprises and how it ties in with the issue of where we're wanting to go. I have 2 minutes left, and I've just started to warm up. So let me move on. I think it's quite easy for Pandi to point fingers at big business, and I don't want to defend them. I mean, anyone who has looked at the amount of sort of cartels will know that every basic item that we eat, bread, look at wheat, the sort of bicycles that you ride, everything is those prices sort of come out of a cartel process. And I kind of really think business has to come clean on these things. But I don't think we should necessarily point at, it's kind of our futures are tied up with big business. I think we should have large enterprises. We should have enterprises that can compete on the international scale. For me, the issue isn't whether the enterprises are big or not. The question is, do they abuse their sort of power? And I think we have to be clear. If you're abusing your sort of power, then you have to deal with it. And I think a great example playing out now is the abuse that Google has just had to deal with. So the kind of future of the economy is about large firms that are innovative. We kind of have to promote them, but there is a point where they cross that line and they start to abuse their sort of power, and at that point we have to deal with it. And you'll be pleased to know that the EU has just found Google 2 billion euros. It's the largest fine ever because it's abusing its power. And I think our laws need to be adapted to allow us to deal with that. Third point. Well, I want to just share this slide with you. It's not my slide, it's Simon Roberts' slide. This shows you our economic relationships to the rest of the world from 1994 to now. So throughout the period of our transition. And what's striking about the picture is that our economic relationships with the rest of the world haven't changed. So that blue bar is our minerals exports. Throughout this time, we simply haven't been able to adapt the economy in a way which would shift us away from a reliance on the export of minerals. So for some part of this time, we had great fun when mineral prices were high, but what we did is we consumed it all. We spent all of the money, and in kind of throughout our transition years, we haven't been able to promote exports of manufactured goods. And I think it's kind of really something we have to deal with. Two last points on social issues. I think we've got to deal with earnings, and we have to deal with the enormous inequality in earnings. So you won't be surprised to know that I think the national minimum wage is a fantastic first step in along that path. But I think we have to deal with the incomes of those at the sort of top end of the distribution as well. I mean, it seems to me we sort of simply can't allow and we can't justify the sort of top CEOs earning the amounts that they do. People earn hundreds of millions of rand a year, and that just seems to me to be unacceptable. I think one part of this story has to be kind of addressing issues of gender. I think we live in the belief, and we've kind of throughout this time, in every sort of document you read, we think we're going to create jobs for all South Africans in the short term. I think we have to admit that that isn't going to happen, and I think it's about time that we freed up the informal economy. I think there's millions of females who live in that part of the economy, and all that we do is to block them from sort of parts of the city. We kind of drive them out of the main urban centers, and we allow them only to undertake their economic activity kind of outside of the mainstream of our economy. And I think it's about time that changed as well. I have a lot more to say, but I think I'll be in trouble, so I'll stop there.
Good evening, colleagues and visitors. It seems a little strange to be making responses to the suit, the person that's not here. But let's have a go anyway. The phrase radical economic transformation has evoked a number of reactions, and I'm sure many of you sitting here can represent the spectrum of those. Irrespective of those contentions, I'd like to begin with the premise of my paper, and that is whether or not we hate the phrase or its origins, or whether we feel that it needs to be defended. The current debate about RET offers the opportunity to put economic justice on the public agenda. I want to make 3 points in my presentation this evening, and I deviated slightly from, quite a bit from the brief that David gave me in doing so. The first is that adding content to the phrase radical economic transformation is an unavoidable exercise. The second point that I want to make is that the ideological content must precede any action plan. And the third is that the content must surface as a social compact, the kind of social compact envisaged in the National Development Plan. So my first section is entitled, What's in a Name? Adding Content to Radical Economic Transformation. As it stands now, RET may not immediately be understood as a call to economic justice, although some proponents of it may argue that it is. To some, it's a radical notion of change. To others, a harbinger of racial tension, and still to others, a vague notion to rationalize state looting. Indeed, over the past few weeks, the language of RET has been replaced by its less contentious cousin, the term inclusive economic transformation. Despite the fact that the phrase has been the phrase RET has been part of populist rhetoric elsewhere in the world, common in many consultancy reports, in South Africa, the term has fallen out of favor since it was associated with the dubious business dealings of and alliances of Bell Pottinger. In addition, when it became clear during the ANC's policy conference that corruption would be the main threat to a radically transformed economy, the phrase eventually faded into the background of economic discourse, with our Honorable Minister arguing at the Reuters Economist of the Year Awards that in his view, and I quote, "Too much of this discourse is politicized, centered around unhelpful binaries, arguing about concepts over content. The prime example, of course, is the bogey phrase, radical economic transformation," close quote. Indeed, the task at hand here, as the Minister suggested, is precisely to talk about the content. When it comes to RET, however, no deliberate investment into the content of the phrase has been made, not least in the public discourse. Take, for instance, an interview by Stephen Grootes on EWN with Enoch Godongwana, the ANC's subcommittee chair on economic transformation. Stephen Grootes asked him, "Do you think there'll be clarification about the term? I mean, everyone in society will have a different view." To which Godongwana urged, "No, you know, the ANC has an interesting, robust discussion and debate prior to any finalization of any decision. I would imagine that once the phrase is finalized and clarified, people will rally behind whatever formulation that emerges," close quote. Let me illustrate the point about adding content to an idea using the phrase non-racialism. The roots of the phrase in practice emerged, as David's book tells us, from activism of the SACP, the Liberal Party of South Africa, and other political formations. Yet it became central to the language and the practice of the ANC in the 1970s. The term was invested with sometimes ambiguous meaning, some of non-racial membership of the ANC, solidarity, and seemed to be self-evident of amongst the activists of the day. Even though scholars with different positions, so not amongst the Congress movement, had similar ideas about racial unity and solidarity, those positions were never termed non-racialism, because non-racialism was a term dedicated to a particular political movement and a particular political moment. But as we know, phrases do not stay within movements or within moments. They are floating signifiers, particularly if their meaning is not clear. Non-racialism more recently has been used by different political formations and as a guise for colorblindness and multiculturalism that only masks inequality. One public intellectual even labeled the phrase an anathema to the black body. So those phrases, like language, circulates through society, sometimes becoming so taken for granted that the original meanings become displaced, and sometimes they become invested by unintended meanings. It's a moment, the linguists tell us, of dispossession of the language, a capturing, if you will, of the original intent, or put another way, the reinvestment of unintended meaning by unintended actors to unintended ends. This is precisely why radical economic transformation needs to be invested with content. It is an unavoidable exercise if we are to have it as a noble principle guiding South Africa's economic trajectory, beyond terms of office and beyond party hegemony. But just what kind of content must we invest into the phrase, and who is the we that gets to invest with content? So the second point of the paper, ideological content must be a compass towards economic justice and precede its action plan. In a paper that considers transformation and reconciliation, Vusi Gumede suggests that while reconciliation requires radical transformation, a dialogue and consensus-based approach on the kind of economy the country requires should precede the practicalities of achieving that transformation. We must therefore consider the kind of economy our country requires, taking as its basis, of course, the kind of economy that we have. The existing norms of our economy are, on the one hand, accumulation, and the other, dispossession. On the one hand, crass and sometimes obscene consumption, and on the other, extreme indebtedness. On the one hand, dominance, and the other, exploitation, advantage, disadvantage, and uneven distribution of precarity. In other words, what we are trying to do, if we just talk about inclusive growth without defining it, what we're trying to do through crude measures of redress is insert a greater number of people into the already untransformed bipolar economic system, which is fundamentally skewed by race and gender. As some of the more poetic considerations of the NDP that the NDP alludes to, this is neither transformative nor economically just. What is called for here is the reformatting of an economy premised on a different, more just set of norms or values. The ideological content must also include a commitment by the state to clean up its economic practice before any actionable plan is on the table. For instance, we cannot decry criminal acts of dispossession, theft by individuals or syndicates, say, who break into government offices, while there is large-scale dispossession through mismanagement of state funds. The Auditor General recently highlighted irregular expenditure under the Public Finance Management Act to the tune of over 206 billion rands. Funds that could have provided almost 2 million houses or 1.1 full tertiary degrees, according to a study by members of civil society group in Save South Africa. The ideological content must include a commitment to responsible language and action. For example, our Honorable President recently called for young people, to be soldiers of RET. We cannot allow imprecise or populist language to run ahead of meticulous consideration of what we mean by it. The ideological content must also include consideration of the scale of our interventions, so that macroeconomic interventions, as important as they are not privileged over microeconomic interventions such as SMME support, financial literacy, decent work, and strengthening accountability structures at ward level. For what will it profit South Africa to have the gains of big business trickle down so slowly and so unevenly that all the while greater inequalities result in greater social fissure, greater disillusionment with the state, and racial hatred? To draw from lessons from public policy making, new ideological norms must be both retrospective, seeking to undo injustices of the past, and prospective, seeking to produce more just futures. These norms or values will serve as guiding principles to any actionable plan and as limits to the relentless quest for targets and indicators. These norms should outlast political office and transcend party politics. And my third and final and short point, the unapologetic imperative inscribed in the NDP as a social compact. The social compact is really asking something of someone. What are we asking, and of whom are we asking it? The social compact in the NDP speaks to the need to foster a compact relationship between state and society, where the collective commitments and action result in transformed societies. So, in the first instance, it's a compact between the state and its citizens, where capital is subservient to this relationship. Capital is subservient to the developmental imperatives of the nation, and where big business is held to account by both an economically literate and empowered public and a capable state to meet the demands of society. Vusi Gumede argues that the economy needs to serve the society. In the second instance, the social compact is asking something of the society itself, as a commitment to realize the just visions set out by policymakers. Earlier, we considered that the ideological must precede the practical. Political philosopher Samuel Scheffler's work allows us to think through what a social compact towards economic justice could mean for society at large, where commitment precedes action. Scheffler argues that when we pursue equality and economic justice, the ideological commitment needs to be relational equality. And this means at its very heart a reciprocal commitment to treating each other with respect, where the establishment of a society of equals is the governing principle. In other words, the commitment to relational equality as a social compact should precede distributive equality or tick box requirements for redress. Scheffler suggests that economic justice through redress and redistribution will necessarily flow easily from the establishment of the relational commitment to equality. Now, under this construct, there's no doubt that redistributive justice will ultimately require deliberate acts of constraint or significant financial cost or loss on the part of business or sections in society who benefit from historical patterns of wealth ownership, old wealth, as Pandey puts it. Yet, because the relational commitment is preeminent, distributive justice necessarily flows as a result of attitudes, dispositions, and practices of relational equality. The social compact, then, will be the kind of relational commitment that will guard against, as Ferial Haffajee puts it in her book, What If There Were No Whites in South Africa? It will guard against a situation where, in our pursuit for economic justice, someone is made to feel like a second-class citizen who does not enjoy the full spectrum of rights and responsibilities that our Constitution grants to each of us. In conclusion, unless we add content to the notion of RET, it remains an empty signifier, ready to be captured and used to varied and unpredictable ends. But the kind of content it calls for is not only programmatic, since action plans are time, politics, and locale bound. Instead, the kind of content called for is an ideological content or set of commitments that will be just, transformative, and outlast auditable targets and terms of office. More especially, the set of commitments will be rooted in a social compact where economy serves society and where relational equality guides necessary forms of distributive equality. This, I believe, colleagues and friends, is the unremitting and unashamedly normative vision of economic justice suggested in the NDP.
Okay, so I've been told I have 2 minutes, so I'll speak extremely fast. Okay, so it seems to me that, just what everybody's been saying, I think we agree, is the problem in South Africa is that it's not just enough to grow. We need to grow in a way that creates more equality. I have a few graphs. I'm trying to decide if I'm going to put them up. What the hell? And we can't see them anyway, so that's fine. Okay. The one thing I'd like to flag, though, is that actually growth in South Africa is, if you take China out of other upper middle income economies, South Africa's economy is more or less the same as everybody else's. And I'm only flagging that because I think there's this myth that goes around that somehow everybody else is growing at 5% and we're the odd ones out, when in fact we're exactly on the norm. Everybody would like to grow at 5%, and it would be nice if we could. I think also the one other point I want to make, which has kind of come up, but I think we tend to lose track. So that's household incomes by decile. And it's all from General Household Survey except the richest 5%. So basically, everybody earning the bottom 60% of the population, households are living on $55,000 a year. The top 5% is living on $471,000 a year. That's all GHS except for the tax data for the top 5%. But I think more important for this discussion is how unequal South Africa is. So our growth looks like everybody else, but our inequality is far worse. So there are only 4 countries in the world that report a Gini of 0.6 and above. We have the honor to be in that group. Now, I should flag at this point, some of the most unequal countries just don't bother to report their Gini, and some of them lie. So Angola says it has a Gini of 0.3, which, you know, is quite nice. Yeah, that's by race. So, yeah, what I really want to get to, I'll come back to that. Okay, so I think we've asked then, in that context, we all agree there needs to be radical economic change. But I think, as the previous speaker said, we don't quite know what we mean by that, or we don't agree. I would flag, however, that I do think there's actually a paper trail in this country. As far as I know, the first official document to build it out was the Medium-Term Strategic Framework, which was 2012? 2010? 2011. And basically, it said what basically every major policy document in South Africa has said, which is we need more equitable investment in human capital. We need to manage the formal sector to promote diversification, investment, and job creation, which I should say has become particularly hard with the end of the commodity boom. As you saw, everybody's growth is down, not just us. In fact, Russia and Brazil are in much worse shape. And it's very hard to say, how do you promote investment and job creation in those circumstances? And also, there should be massive growth in assets and productive capacity for those who have been historically excluded. Yeah? And in that context, everybody agrees, David, that spatial densification and doing something about the former homeland areas is kind of critical. I just wanted to flag that because I think what's interesting is there has come about a new definition in the past year, which has been about radical economic transformation, meaning narrowly BEE, or BE in the narrow sense of promoting black ownership in established companies. And I want to talk about that just a bit, just to say, so I think it's important to unpack the relationship between those two projects. And I think one of the problems with the BE project is it often seems like we're saying evil individuals own these companies. If we shift into better individuals, life will be better. The companies will respond better to government's pleas to be nicer corporate citizens. But there's a problem with that, and that's what this graph is showing. This is JSE ownership. And the really interesting thing is how it has shifted from being ownership by conglomerates in '94, which is basically Anglo-American and a few other big companies, and the financial institutions, to being ownership now by institutions. And that's largely pension funds and asset managers. Sorry, Martin, I'm looking at you. Pension funds and asset managers from South Africa and abroad. No? So when you act like changing ownership to a few individuals will make a difference, I think when people talk about white monopoly capital, they think somehow it's someone like Anton Rupert. And in fact, I think they pick on Anton Rupert because it's precious hard to find anybody else. But actually, individuals are not the people who control these big companies. They tend to be controlled by institutions. And mostly all they want is high returns and high share prices. And managers control the decisions, but they're also trying to meet that shareholder demand. And that's where you get the short-termism. That's what we talk about when we talk about financialization. If we don't change that kind of system, bringing in a few new shareholders and a few new managers is likely not to help. Ideology will only get you so far. Even nationalism will only get you so far. A second problem has been, and you can see that green thing at the top, that's officially BE groups on the stock exchange. And the problem with it has always been, you can see it there, it tends to follow the commodity cycle. So when commodity prices are high, people get to buy into the mines, and then the commodity prices crash and they go underwater and they sell out of the mines. And if we can't come up with a better model, the thing is unsustainable anyways. Yeah? And there's a cost to it, which we tend to ignore. That if you push companies to bring in new investors and to finance those new investors, and to dilute their stock to bring in new investors, people pay something for that, and there's less funds available for investment and job creation and providing housing for miners and all those other things we want companies to do. So one of the problems for me with this model that says we should center radical economic transformation not on changing the structures of the economy, but on changing ownership at the top, is that we need to count the cost, and nobody's ever figured out a good way to do that. Most people don't even try. So that's one thing about radical economic transformation, which is there is actually a fundamental disagreement about what it means. Yeah? This one's for real, huh? Okay, the second issue I think we should ask about is, if we agree that our policies have said forever we need to come up with a more equitable economy, and since the RDP we've kind of agreed on how to do that, the question is, why has it been so hard to get there? And I think we have to then start talking about power. That in any democracy there are two centers of power. One is the elected state, and one is the power in the economy. And in every democracy, there's an uneasy relationship there, with more or less co-option, more or less collaboration, more or less conflict. In South Africa, because we're such an unequal society compared to others, and because of the extreme concentration of much of the economy, it's even harder to have those two centers of power work together in a way that actually brings about the democratic project. After all, the aim of democracy is largely to ensure that the state acts on behalf of the majority, so why hasn't it managed to do that in the economy? I would argue the solution is not formal pacting, unlike the NDP. In effect, as Miriam Altman once said, we actually have a pact. It goes like this. Rich people get to live the way they always have. Workers get to have unions and equitable access to institutions, and everybody else gets social grants. And I think the problem is that pact is falling apart because it doesn't do enough to deal with inequality. And I'm not sure what we're asking of poor people and working people, because the pact was always just be patient and things will get better. And to go back to them and say, now be patient some more, is problematic. So the problem for me with the pact is we kind of know what we want from business. We don't really know what everybody else is supposed to give to get business on board. Yeah? And I have to say, man, I'm not sure the solution is just to say shed the parts of the state that don't work. Because if the aim is to make the democratic state work so that it can transform the economy, you'd have to be careful with that. And I would argue there are three reasons the state has been so unresponsive. Firstly, it's difficult for the state to manage big business to meet the needs of the voters, even without the corruption that we all know about. There are some big systemic problems. Firstly, in an unequal society, we have big fights about policy, and they're nowhere more intense than within government. Secondly, we have a structure of the state itself that makes it very hard to ensure alignment. So I counted up, there are like 10 different departments in the economic policy space, and that's not counting the ones that have a big impact on the economy, like education, but are not formally economics. Then there are the SOCs. All of them have different constituencies, all of them tend to have somewhat different takes on the economy, and there's no center in the state that can ensure a degree of conformity besides the cluster, which is a bit of a joke, and cabinet, which is overwhelmed and doesn't have the technical capacity to assess the proposals that come from the economics departments. Almost done, okay? The second problem is that capital has its own power, and it's not so easy to say how to deal with it. That capital can always threaten disruption, can threaten to leave the country, does it all the time. I don't know that there's a social consensus out there amongst voters about how much they would be willing to pay to bring about radical economic change. So how much, if all the big auto companies and all the big banks just close down, is that what we want? Yeah? And if we don't want that, how far are we prepared to push them to get what we need, if that's what they threaten? And I would argue that unless we can find answers to these questions, we can end up with radical change which is devastating for the economy and society, or we could continue to have only gradual change and end up like Latin America, which has been doing this for 300 years. So, thanks.
You kind of figure if you ask economists to stick to 10 minutes that they can count just at least on two hands, but no. Thank you all very much, and my apologies for being a fascist chair. One other apology, I did not acknowledge Walid Balawi from UNDP, who's a key member of our partnership, so a belated but nonetheless important acknowledgement. I'm not going to try and facilitate discussion, because I think it's time. You've sat here and you've been very patient, and I've seen people exclaiming and doing all sorts of other things, so I'm going to go straight to the audience. I think, do we have a roving mic? We have a roving Simon and some roving mics, and I'll start on this side, and I'll take the lady there, and I'll work, and the gentleman on my right and in the middle. That's three. Shall we go in threes? Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. I am a representative from the Embassy of Sweden, and as such, an outsider looking in. And I must say, one thing that has struck me, and it's a comment, and maybe it's a question to you, Professor Khan, is the focus on ownership and the almost total ignoring of the issue of income. For the people on the JSC that we saw, of course, even if we talked about ownership and even if we'd made that completely equal, I mean, not all South Africans will be owners of companies on the stock exchange. For most people, especially those who actually have a job, which is a good one, it doesn't really matter who owns the company. It does matter that they have an income they can live on and that they can afford school fees and so on. And somehow I understand, sort of course still as an outsider, I understand the historic background to why the focus is so much on ownership, because of the injustice of the previous system and the history of colonialism. But I find it interesting how little focus there is on income, and I would like to just ask if you have a reflection on that.
Okay, we'll go with the chap who got the mic, and the other mic goes over there. Sir?
Right. Thanks a lot. Jack Kossoff from day jobs working for the Premier of Gauteng, but I guess I'm asking this in my personal capacity. Neva, I just wanted to put you into one of possibly your more traditional footings, looking at value chain analysis, because one of the things that we are really sort of looking at quite actively from the Gauteng side is how to break down barriers to economic opportunity by activating the township economy more thoroughly. And so a lot of the work that we've done, for example, we've surveyed 80,000 firms in 9 townships across Gauteng that are on the formal-informal boundary and are actively linking them to the formal economy. What it's revealed is that our value chain diversification is sclerotic. The formal economy right now doesn't really understand how to diversify itself, to deconcentrate itself. And I mean, you've mentioned some warnings about some bad policy directions we could go down. It seems obvious to me there are some very good policy directions that are similarly radical about if we do deconcentrate the way value chains work and the way supply chains work in this country. Just wanted to understand your feeling of where that should be in the policy hierarchy.
Thanks, Jack.
My name is Sipho Masihu. I'm from 1912 Radio. I work with at least about 28 young people. I've got a serious concern as a young man myself, especially looking at this document presented by the professor. In the last 24 years, some of you leaders sat through documents such as GEAR, ASGISA, the New Growth Path, the NDP. My God. You still don't have a solution. Our people are hungry, our people are starving, and 4 of you stood up, you all disagreed with your ideologies. I'm really confused. What are we gonna do? I mean, my reality is I see young people hungry every day. I see young people trying to find job opportunities, young people looking for mentors. You know, my question to you would be, who are you mentoring? Who are you supporting? Who are you paying for their school fees? What are you doing? I mean, we can all sound smart here, which is nice, but, you know, this country is in a mess because some of the educated people have been talking and talking, and nothing is happening. It's just, I'm really concerned, especially when young people ask sometimes for taxi fares on a daily basis. So what are you guys doing?
Okay, thank you very much. Who wants to go first? Gavin? You go the
I'll go.
You got your mic? Okay, as we get ready to answer, can I just say in response to the last colleague that while I think we all share the sentiment, if you want to understand that hardship, you don't have to be out of this place. The inequality in society is inside this university. If you walk out in the evening when you leave here, you'll go past the syndicate rooms of my colleagues at the business school, which litter that way. And you'll find the lights are on all night because students are sleeping there because it's warm. And the students come to us at about 9 o'clock at night and they say, can you go to Mike's and buy us some food, please? And it's not because we're hungry. It's because we're so hungry we can't sleep. And the academics in this and almost every other school have a small pot of money that they put money into every month to buy food for those students who can't afford the taxi drive home and can't afford res, are sleeping in rooms and can't eat. And so if you ask what we're doing, we're trying to educate the next generation to do better than we've done. That may seem small and irrelevant, but it's what we do. But it's coupled with direct assistance, dipping into your funds to pay student fees. Every single person on this panel is paying student fees, not for our children, we're paying for them as well, but for students who are sitting, some of them in this room. So I think I take the point, and it's a fair question, but I think to expect 4 economists to agree with each other and come up with a solution is possibly pushing it too far. But your point is taken nonetheless. Neva, you go.
I want to thank David for taking on that question. The one thing I would say is actually we agree more than we disagree. What's really interesting is even the things we agree about don't get implemented. Né? And I think that we need to, that economists have tended to say somebody else's problem around implementation, and that's a problem. In terms of deconcentrating supply chains, I think we have to say, I'm sure you know this, the question is what actually led to the suppression of small business in South Africa. And by the way, that's why we talk so much about ownership. We've done huge amounts of stuff on income. We have amongst the most unequal wage distribution in the world also. But as I'm sure you know, the World Bank says the two things that lead to reproduction of inequality is assets and education. And I think they leave a few things out there, but I think that is why we talk so much about assets. And then there's the land question, of course, which, However, one of the problems in South Africa is that apartheid actually destroyed most small business. So in other countries, people at least inherit from their families some kind of assets, some kind of existing production structure or sales structure. They have a customer base, they know where they have to buy things, they have some knowledge of production and bookkeeping. Here we tend to say to people, and there are market institutions to serve them, and they have a site, where they can function. Here we tend to say to people, start with nothing and find a way to make a business work. So I would argue we need to think much more holistically, whether it's in terms of land reform or in terms of township economies, about what would you have to do to provide all those things that are missing in South Africa that exist in other developing economies to support small and micro enterprise. In that context, part of it is how do you, where relevant, link people into the formal value chains? How do people articulate with the formal value chains in a way that's more advantageous? And honestly, we could, as you know, go on for days and days about it. But I think to me it's more that issue, that's only part of the problem. That if we don't also address how do you ensure that people have production skills, have bookkeeping skills, have capital, have a site, have upstream and downstream linkages, have access to skills, and what are the market institutions that would deliver all of that? And by market institutions, it might be an NGO, it might be a co-op, but that the existing market institutions tend to exclude them. And I mean, the obvious one that everybody knows about is retail chains. You can't get into a retail chain as a small business in this country. So in effect, that market institution is not serving them. Yeah?
Yeah, I want to respond to Neva and a few tweets. Kind of saw, a few tweets, come especially from our students who said Professor Belodi is becoming a right winger. So I want to make clear what my views are on the kind of issue of state-owned enterprises. I'm not saying necessarily that Eskom should be privatized, but I do think Eskom should be broken up, and it should be properly regulated. So, and I think that's a fundamental difference. So, I think we kind of shouldn't be ideological about this. I think it's not a question about whether kind of ownership in kind of in the state or kind of ownership in the private sector is the right thing. I think it's about how we make sure that the utilities are priced in a way which is going to kind of help us to get growth, and is going to be priced in a way that serves the people, not serves certain interests. And I think in the Eskom case, it's quite clear that the structure that they're in is forcing them to keep out much more efficient producers of energy, and that's something that we have to deal with. We have to break them up, and it's not a question of privatization. I mean, on the kind of question of kind of South African Airways, I think we must ask ourselves, how much do we pour into this, and what are the reasons for it to be in the public space? I can't see any good reasons for that. I want to also say something about the informal economy and the township economy, because I can't resist it. I have to say, I find the idea of the way we describe it as the township economy something that I find repulsive, because it's saying that those who kind of operate in that part of the economy are somehow not part of the mainstream of the economy. I'm kind of often struck when I'm in countries such as India. You see lots of low-income enterprise that is supported by both the middle class and the upper classes. So walk around Bombay, Delhi, and you see those with income supporting the economic activity of those who don't have high incomes. I think the problem here is we have an economy where those who produce with low incomes don't enjoy the support of those who have incomes to spend, and there's a really odd way about which around which the economy operates. For me, it's not about the sort of township economy. It's about the fact that those in sort of power really operate in a way which excludes small operators. And I think we need to move away from sort of talking about the township economy to really dealing with this problem.
Neva, 30 seconds.
30 seconds. No, I just wanted to say, I always understood township economy, and maybe somebody should clarify, this is another vague signifier or whatever, to mean these have been treated as dormitory towns. How do we make the townships more holistic? So it's not the whole of small business or informal business. It's about how do we make the townships, in terms of David's spatial thing, places where people can find work and recreation and so on, and not just be dormitories.
Okay, can I make one small story just to try and make a point? Firstly, the excuse, I guess, that you've all got your phones out is you see people being rude about us on the platform. Well, I'm very glad I can't tweet or be a twit. I've seen what it costs certain politicians who shall not be named. But I live in a place called Emerentia, and we get a newsletter, and we got one last night, and it said, crime wave, as usual. And there was a story that said there'd been 3 armed robberies, and it was all terrible. But it then went on to say there were also an increasing number of what they called vagrants living in sleeping in shop doorways and so on. And then it began to say please can you understand that these are construction workers working in your suburb, and they are being paid 600 Rand every 14 days. So they can't afford to go home. And they sleep here, and every 14 days with that 600 bucks they go home, because that's their wage for 2 weeks. And please can you therefore interrogate your builders so they actually pay a decent wage to their workers. And then you look who it was written by, and it was written by the local DA councillor. And everything is completely topsy-turvy in this world. So what a political message you may expect from one place comes from a complete other, but the bottom line that remains the same is that poor black workers are being screwed. In the suburbs in this case. It could be anywhere else in any other case. And that, I think, is the bottom line that the panel is trying to deal with. So you had your chance. I'm going to come back. Let me take 3 from this side, then I'll come back to that side. Is it okay? So I've got 1, 2, 3, straight down the spine of that. I think one of them accused the dean of being a right-winger. Put your hands up again, please, so the mics can find you. Yeah. No, yours are coming. It's those 3 there. I'll
Hello?
come back.
Okay, cool. My name is Nkululeko Tselane. I'm a law student at this university, which ironically I agree with all the panelists except for the head of my faculty. But my question is more on the globalization and the Africanization of our economy, because I wanna get a better understanding, because all the panelists, you kind of mentioned examples of DRC and of the Latin American countries, but you never really spoke about our relationship to them and how that relates to radical economic transformation. Because I think we understand that we can't operate in a vacuum and in that kind of thing. So maybe if you could expand on that more. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you. My name is Fasia Hassan. I'm the former Secretary General of the WITS SRC. But let me address Prof. Volodia, also the Dean of my faculty. Look, thank you, Dean, for clarifying very clearly that you were not advocating for privatization. I think that assists. But I also want to speak about, you said that we cannot be arguing something that's ideological. But it's ideology that's the backbone of our economic policy. So one cannot say that when we look at state-owned enterprises, we cannot be looking at it with some amount of ideology. I think it's 100% necessary to do so. And in doing so, we can hopefully unpack in the manner in which we deal with these things, right? But I also want to speak, and this is actually the core point that I wanted to make, particularly on Twitter. That is that privatization does not equal efficiency or service delivery. The fact that an institution is privatized, I don't know why in the minds of South Africa we assume, oh wow, this is the solution to the problem. And it's not. Privatization for me is very problematic. And I think that's maybe where we need to unpack and understand. So we can agree maybe that ESCOM needs to be broken up and divided, but that doesn't mean that we must be privatizing the ability to deliver services to our people. I think that we need to address where the actual issue is in government's inability to do that, and then what do we do to equip government to do it? And then very lastly, this was a question that I had. You spoke about short-term employment versus long-term employment. I think there's a problematic nature in that, and I can understand where it's coming from. But frankly, we don't have the option of not focusing on so-called short-term employment right now. There's no way we can move forward only focusing on the long term when we have these issues in front of us. And I think maybe it's part of the problem of policymakers, right? How do they create the platform to get to the NDP while at the same time addressing the short-term inequalities that we face? Thanks, Prof. I look forward to the Twitter war after this.
There was a third hand. Yeah, there. I'm coming back. I'm going to take 3 and then I'll come up to the end there.
Hi, my name is Atina Ngamso. I'm a student. And I want to talk a little bit about the vague terms that the radical economic transformation has been set under, and ask whether, and I think the conclusion that I come to, I think applies to like small business or like each one teach one piecemeal approaches to the economy out of people's misunderstanding or desperation in the face of real South Africa. But the question I want to ask is, do you think that the term is vague because it's difficult to attach real meaning and substance to the term, or that it best works that way because we know something that we've always known, we knew it during colonialism, during apartheid, we knew it in '94, we know it now. And that is, we've long reached an impasse, which is that white South Africa is not going to give up its things in order to make this country a country that works. And South Africa's economy is only going to exist insofar as it services and serves white South Africa. And when the people lay a demand for that to end, then capital will threaten to leave, and then we'll be left with what seems, at least according to Professor Imran, the foregone conclusion of the DRC. I mean, if it is the case that everybody else has kept with the social compact, has waited, has done short-term work, and we know who we're talking about when we say like short-term and long-term work, because that employment question is a question that belongs to new economy or capital or whatever stands in for black these days. And by black, I mean black African. So is the term vague? Is the signifier a vague signifier, a floating signifier, because we just are having a difficult time attaching real substance to the term, or because we've come to popularize the term radical, and so it only makes sense to outline an economic policy that has that kind of wording when we know that white capital is leading our policy making. It will continue to, since like GIA and ASGISA and everything else that we have done that's been led by capital. We just have no way of coming to terms with what we've always really known, and that is that the South African economy is only going to work a particular way. And so what do you think the conclusion is? I mean, should we go to DRC now or later?
Okay, I'm assuming Imran may want to respond, but do you want to start and the others can?
Okay, so let me deal with the question with the question from Fasiha. You know, I mean, to kind of project the sort of comments that I made to mean somehow a lack of any ideology, I think is kind of just awfully simplistic. I think we all kind of have our ideologies, and I think we all kind of driven in South Africa by the sort of passion of that ideology, and sort of I don't for one moment suggest that ideology is unimportant, but I don't think we should be making kind of important choices about the economy strictly on ideological grounds. I think we have to ask some kind of really hard questions. I think we have to understand the challenges, and I think we must make the choices in a way where we've sort of got the evidence, where we understand the trade-offs, and where we make the choices in a sensible way. So let's I mean, since we've kind of used the Eskom example, kind of Eskom's in kind of state hands now. It kind of reported really proudly that it made a profit of about R1 billion. What it hasn't told us is that making that it made that profit on an asset base of about 800 billion. So I think we really have to ask ourselves, is that a waste of our resources? Is that a sensible use of our resources? And what are the other ways in which we can use those resources? I don't for one moment think all of our answers are going to come from the private sector. And I mean, for those who are interested, I wrote a piece in the Business Day yesterday, laying out what I think some of the problems in the private sector are, and what are the ways in which the private sector has failed us. But I think we also have to accept that the private sector is a key part of that it's a key part of our economy, and that we've got to get the private sector to work a lot better for us to get the jobs that we need. And I think the private sector is a key sort of partner in South Africa. That's not to say that they're all kind of great people, but that's also not to say that they're all awful people. I think there are parts of the business community that are sincerely interested and committed to making South Africa work, and I think we have to work with that sort of part of South Africa. I think we also have to ask ourselves a few serious questions about the state. Okay, we all make all sorts of kind of remarks about the development state and about state capacity. I think we have to seriously confront the fact that the last while has shown us that the state itself is in serious crisis, that we have serious capacity problems in the state, and that we've sort of got to deal with those issues as well. I think we can't assume that the state will do the job that we expect it to do unless we start to change some of that. I kind of really don't understand these sort of comments about short and long-term employment. My sort of point was simply that we've lived under the belief for a long time that we're going to solve the unemployment problem in the short term. I think a much more sensible way to deal with the issue would be to admit and never shown us that our growth performance isn't out of line with the rest of the world. So we're not going to get 8 and 10% growth rates. We're not going to solve the unemployment problem in the short term, and that means that we have to face up to it and then make some choices about how we provide people with the opportunity to increase their incomes. And I think there's millions of our people who live in the informal economy who are being blocked by our own state from being allowed to earn incomes, and I think we should unblock that.
Okay, I'm going to go Pandi, Karen, Neva, and ask you to be brief.
Well, I want to respond to the question of globalization. From the perspective of my own paper, where I spend a lot of time focusing on South African business. Now, if you look at a company like Anglo-American and others who followed Anglo-American, in the late 90s, they came to the government to say they have to go and locate somewhere else because they can't have access to capital if they're based in Johannesburg. Now, it seems to me a contradiction in terms, because globalization itself implies that the world is a smaller place. You don't have to go to London to get access to funding. But here's a company that enriched itself for over a century. With the dawn of democracy, it decides to go elsewhere. So, and a lot of these companies have since done that. And it's not without some serious economic implications. Because on the one hand, we're crying out for foreign direct investment. At the same time, domestic capital is emigrating. So foreign investors would, of course, logically ask, why should we go to South Africa when your own people are leaving. So the point I want to make is that globalization is used to serve many purposes, depending on what you want to achieve, what you want to motivate to government or anywhere else. If I may, David, I want to respond to Dean Velodia's comments here. The first is, I did not say economic growth is not important. That economic growth is not
Order.
important.
Minister Manuel.
I said 2 to 3% economic growth is not enough. Right? That's what I said. And if you can't think out of the box, you can remain in this hopeless situation and say unemployment cannot be solved in the short term. That's great to say that if you're sitting in a university and writing papers and not taking account of the lives of the unemployed. So I think it's really a negative way of looking at this situation. To say, because other countries are not growing, we can't grow. Well, a lot of other countries grew in East Asia, more recently in Latin America, when some other countries were not growing. So I think that we need to be much more positive, that it can't be more of the same. It has to be different.
Yeah, after that.
Karen.
Andy.
We'll do Karen, Neva, and then I'm coming back to you. Don't worry. I see hands.
I think I just want to make a small point to my fellow panelists. You know, there's a kind of assumption, and I'm not an economist, so David, I'm not an economist. I'm a geographer. But there's a kind of assumption that ideology is something emotive and impractical, and real choices or practicalities are something pragmatic and rational. I think both are important, and I don't think we need to say, if we think pragmatically, we need to think outside the realm of ideology. Our ideology shapes how we think about pragmatic choices. It's just a small kind of social point. The lady asked about the vague terms of radical economic transformation and whether it's meant to be vague. You know, one of the things, and from policy studies in the School of Governance, we'll tell you that some of these terms are meant to be vague to allow for a suite of interventions, but also lots of the language comes from consultancy reports, and it's not authored by the state at all, right? Not yet. And so it's vague, and it's an empty or floating signifier so that it can be later invested with meaning by the state. And so this idea of language in policy that's particularly in the first instance scripted by consultants and people like Bell Pottinger and all of that, or companies like Bell Pottinger, is not uncommon practice. It's in fact the way some policy making works. So I think to think that there's a kind of conspiracy behind the vagueness is also a little bit maybe unfair. But at the same time, I think that since the corruption scandals hit the press, and when Save South Africa came up with a whole lot of stats, there was indeed a pullback of the term radical, and a kind of more cautious kind of approach to say, okay, let's not maybe step on so many toes. But as David mentioned, I think right at the beginning, one of the risks is that because the idea of white minority capital and radical economic transformation as terms or as ideas was so mired in the whole Gupta issues, Oak Bay and marketing companies, that the danger is that those terms that could have contained some really useful practical solutions to move us forward has now been, I suppose, treated as a hot potato, like, oh no, we can't touch that. It's something that we have to distance ourselves from. So I think you make a very valid point.
So firstly, in terms of Africa, I think that one of the problems for South Africa is that there's the ratio of our GDP per capita to those of our neighbors is around 8 to 10 to 1. For the other BRICS, it's like 3 or 4 to 1. And what that points to me is the countries that have managed to accelerate growth and industrialize have all had a much stronger region. So I would argue that we can't have any kind of economic development, radical or otherwise, unless we do much more to build the region. And I have to say we have been remarkably bad about it. And that's another one where I think we actually all know what some of the key answers are. We just never managed to prioritize it enough to do it. Yeah? Having said that, so I would argue, yes, you can't talk about economic development in South Africa without saying, how do we bring the region along better? How do we reduce this huge, it's one of the most unequal regions in the world by every dimension. So that issue applies there. In terms of ideology and policy, I just want to say, look, I think the problem is this. Ideology does two things. It points you towards whose problems you want to address. Well, three things. It points you towards how you analyze the causes of those problems, and it points you towards solutions. Whose problems you address is not really susceptible to much research. You can research whether the problem exists and who's affected by it. But if I think the problems of the poor are more important than the problems of the rich, the research is not going to convince me otherwise. Yeah? But once you start talking solutions, the ideology can point you in a general direction, but trust me, you'd better check if those solutions make sense in your specific context. And I think that's what people say when they're saying we don't want to be entirely ideological. So they're not saying ideology doesn't influence how they think. They're saying we need to control it when it comes to coming up with specific solutions. And one of the horrifying things about doing policy is you're playing with people's lives. And you really have to try and get it right. And at the same time, you really have to try and do things, so that's a tension right there. In terms of whether, I think radical economic, I was actually there when the term first came into the South African government. I have to say it was not a consultant, it was a minister. And I think said minister, well, I'm not going to say what it was, and no, it's nobody in the room as far as I know, was just trying, where we came about it from him was, I think he was just trying to capture a commitment to real change, that there's a recognition also in government that you can't keep saying to people, be patient. And they wanted to promise change. The trouble is, and apologies to all ministers in the room, but my experience of ministers is they often make the promise and then they come to the public servants and say, now find out a way to do it. And then we find out that we actually have these very big debates about how best to do it. And I would argue those debates, like I said, reflect both the fact that government itself still operates in silos and the fact, more fundamentally, that it's a very divided society, and those divisions are reflected in the policies that are acceptable within government. And that's been one of the weakest, when you talk about implementation, I actually think that's why we don't implement. That we don't have any central group that can actually say, now we're going to drive this one, whether it's on the right or the left. And that's also why you get this thing of one day we tell big business we love them, and the next day we hate them. And then we get a scare and we go back and say we love them again. So I would argue that it's vague because we agree we need something radical in the sense of real change. But we don't agree about how to get there. And that's why you end up in an impasse. And then finally, just one thing about inequality and growth. Some of you may remember we've had this debate before. I was with Rudy. He was saying, remember the 90s? Does it feel like we're back in the 90s? Because there's a debate about, can you get to growth without addressing inequality in a country that is as unequal as South Africa? And I think the consensus is, no, you can't. But there's still a debate about how you prioritize those things. And I would argue if we're serious about getting to 4 or 5% growth, we could do it, but only if we do the structural changes towards equality that enable us to have a much more systematic policy environment and make those systematic changes that we need to bring about growth.
Okay, thank you. Now I've got hands. I know where I'm going. I'm going to take 6 last questions, 3 and 3, because it's 8:25, and the people who are going to serve food also need to go home tonight. So I understand that lots of people want to ask questions, including people giving me dirty looks. This young man's been very patient. You're number 1. You're number 2. There's a chap here in the jumper. Number 3. That's this side done. Number 4. You two are lost out. I'm going to the very back. Number 5. And the man with the hair in the middle. Number 6. Bald people are allowed to say man with the hair in the middle. And I apologize to everyone else.
I think you said, I took my hand from the word-go, I even click like this, you don't see me.
We'll all be nibbling food outside.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Pleasure.
You don't see me.
He's complaining he wasn't seen. Yeah, I don't know.
Radical facilitator's choice. Okay. If I didn't see anyone else, I apologize. You're welcome to leave or stay. Okay, can we get through the 6 questions and then 6 brief answers?
Okay, my name is Mfesane, law lecturer here at the School of Law here at Wits. My concern is directed at you, Neve, and to some degree to you, Pandi, as well. On the point of there is no real face to the economy, in a sense that the JSE is owned by institutions and so on. But you'd appreciate, I'm sure as an economist better than I would, that the institutions themselves that own the shares at the JSE serve a purpose. The profits and the dividends don't go swimming in the sea. They go to pockets. And the question is, what color are the pockets? Now, the point I'm trying to get at here is this, that ultimately, if we insist on being blind on the race of the economy, that contributes to the agitation. That's why we have these frustrations around radical economic transformation and so on and so forth. When we talk about inclusive growth, what are we talking about? It's a racial issue. Isn't it then that the very reason we're at the point we're at and we have this agitation and social unrest and so on and so forth, and perhaps compounding the issue of race, that we deny the existence of a color that is attached to the economy itself? It's perhaps an unfair question because an economist is not a sociologist, but you raise the point, therefore I perhaps should be asking you the question. Is that not the agitation? And it builds from what the former president has said. White monopoly capital, what is that? I mean, what does it mean, what is that? People that own shares in these companies are white by color. They're not black. Isn't there therefore the issue that we have to get to a point where we take away the race from the color of the shares? And if we, until we do that, then we have a problem. So perhaps to ask you a direct question, do you see the economy as being colorblind?
Okay. Gentleman in the middle. Can I ask that questions are brief? Yeah.
Thanks.
He's a lawyer, he can't help it.
My name is Benedict. I'm gonna be very, very precise. I'm interested into the systematic questions, right? Because I'm getting the sense that the issue of efficiency, it keeps on shifting from private to public. I just wanted to check, Prof, from your research, has there been a research that looked at the projections if private sector can invest more locally, especially now that we're going through these economic challenges in terms of the money that they've accumulated, especially within the space of gear, because at least I believe by that time there was enough growth. I think it went to 3.4 because I believe they targeted 6%. And if that's the case, have private sector considered to really invest locally so that we can stimulate the economic growth? The other question, it's with regards to the policy, because I feel that there is more critique that comes to the policy, and I want to agree with Mr. Pando there, because I believe that the state, post-94, they have stitched the system at the policy level better. But the question that I have that's research-based also is, to what extent has academic and also Lubick Group had looked at the midterm strategic framework on how it links different policies so that they can speak in one term? Because I remember at the SONA this year, there was an issue on a national development plan to say that there are policies that are not really interlinked. So I just wanted to check that question. Thanks.
Gentleman over there.
Hi, my name is Sunny, and I'm an activist. I just want to return to perhaps one slide that Dr. Karen Abrams spoke about. And it's important because it drives home this issue. We can't have this conversation in the current context about radical economic transformation without talking about state capture, looting, extraction, and the Guptas in a way. So I want to go back to one slide, and I have 50 of them, but I'm only going to concentrate on one. The Public Finance Management Act, and so this is empirical data, speaks about irregular expenditure for the last 5 years. So we float the number of 205,850 million. Now, the numbers are so huge that we don't think about it carefully. But I just want to give you four numbers. In terms of houses that could have been built just from the irregular expenditure, 1,880,455 houses. Tertiary degrees are and I'm assuming 175,000 rand a degree for a 3-year degree. 1,188,793 tertiary degrees. We're just using some figures, we can get it correct. And then the smart schools, it costs 120 million rand to build a smart school in Gauteng. We could have built 1,720 schools. And we could have done 5 million water and sanitary connections. We can't have this conversation about radical economic transformation when we don't talk about looting and about state looting. We just want to talk about one more thing. 2 billion rand for given loan, for given amount of the optimum gold mine. If you want to talk about those figures are mind-boggling. And those are just 2 incidences. We can talk about 50 incidences in the last 2 years.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go straight to this side. There's one right at the back, and one in the middle. Man with the hair.
Good evening. My name is Tami Powe. I'm from a company called Simung. And we facilitate debating and public speaking tournaments for young kids in school-going age. And just to transfer the knowledge, in that space as well. So we appreciate these conversations very deeply. I just have 2 things I want to address. The first is the concentration on ownership as far as like radical economic transformation is concerned. And I think this goes to Dr. Neva. And how historically and currently our posture is to look at getting black people ownership spaces in very established companies. And by expanding the BEE quota system and all those kinds of things. But what it has worked out to be historically is that it created an entirely new black elite as opposed to distributing the reparations of apartheid down to people on the ground and people actually benefiting. And surely, like from a developmental state perspective, the more important thing to be doing or concentrating on is trying to open up the economy so that black people can own competitive businesses in the economic space, as opposed to trying to open up spaces of ownership where they've never owned these businesses in the first place. So I think the conversation of RET should actually start to, and the rhetoric even, needs to start to go and shift towards that direction in the first instance. Secondly, is this issue of policy turnover, and I mean, this is issues that have been raised by Professor Somadota Fikeni and many other scholars as well, is that over the past 23 years, we've gone through so many policies, and what seems to be common thread as a problem has been the implementation discipline. So my question is, with the rhetoric around radical economic transformation, with this new wave of rhetoric coming up, does it mean, one, that the current policy, the NDP, is completely in tandem with this rhetoric, or does it mean that we are looking at a whole new policy framework, policy picture altogether? And isn't that what drives investment crazy in this country anyway? The fact that we have very sporadic and ill-disciplined manner in which we implement and stick to policy implementation altogether. Thank you.
Thank you. Up the very back there.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. You can go first.
Whoever's got the mic goes first.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Kifenzo Mkari. I am the current SRC president. So, this engagement, I think we all agree that the problem here is implementation, right? And I think the part of the reasons why the problem is implementation is because we have come to run public institutions as private institutions. So we call them public in names, but the way they are run, they are private. So the role that they are supposed to do in responding to the challenges of society, when those solutions are brought up, they are commercialized, and the property question comes in. For instance, you look at education in itself, right? Where like VET is it's a public institution. But when you look at the problems that it's responding to, right, within the context of South Africa, it's for private sector. It's not for us. You look at institutions like CSIR, they are responding to challenges of private sector, not the public sector, right? So I think in part of looking at the policy framework, we must begin to say, when we say an institution, it's public, how do we ensure that the property around it trickles down to respond to the problems that the public is facing, right? And I think it will go back to the ideological perspective once again. But I just wanted to put that comment that we must try to deal with this thing of face value public, where else the real show is a private sector mandate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is the last one, and then we'll take the...
No, thank you very much, Prof. My name is Floyd Shubham. I'm the former SRC president. It looks like people are introducing themselves as a SRC. Yes, I'm a former SRC president.
Let me just say before Floyd continues, the fact that I have a red tie, a red thing, and red socks does not mean that I picked him out for this.
That's, you know, the byproduct of neo-colonial capitalism all over the world, everywhere in the world, will be high levels of poverty, of inequalities, and unemployment, because the neo-colonial capitalism will mean that the colonial features of capitalism continue of being the producers of primary products and importers of all finished goods and services. That is what defines South Africa today. And then an attempt to transform the economy from 1994 has been one to try to balance the macroeconomics, the fiscal policies and monetary policies, and neglecting the microeconomics. That is why Trevor would know that throughout the attempts to balance economic policy has been through national treasury, which otherwise is supposed to deal with fiscal policy, and not the microeconomics of trade policy in terms of what is needed in industrialization. So it looks like there is an attempt to deal with the inequalities outside of its causal factor, which is capitalism. So the problem is capitalism, and you can't therefore say that the issue of ownership doesn't matter. It does matter. The issue is, how do you deal with the ownership question? Is, do you de-racialize capitalism? You just transfer shares from white shareholders to black shareholders. What is the impact on ordinary people on the ground? That is what should be dealing with that. Then the transfer of wealth should be to say that let us transfer the ownership of South Africa's capital from few individuals to majority through a variety of interventions that could be put there. There are attempts to could deal with it in a different way. Even in the most capitalist of countries, there's a story which must do history, a background check on, called Jean Lewis in the UK, which is owned by its own workers. But there can be a proper balance of benefiting workers, such that at the end of every financial year, workers receive dividends as well, not just the pension funds receiving dividends, like as is the case now, because a substantial component of South Africa's economy is owned by pension funds and these asset management companies, but those do not benefit people directly in the immediate.
Can we
So
get
it's a different question that must be looked into. Lastly, I don't know why you're discussing radical economic transformation, because one, there's no scientific meaning of it. Two, it means nothing. It means absolutely nothing. Like Malusi came to the Standing Committee on Finance, and then in his main presentation, he says, we're in pursuit of radical economic transformation. And when I ask him, what do you mean by that? He says, no, we're still going to resolve in the policy conference. And the policy conference is passed now. There's still no resolution of what is radical economic transformation. It means nothing. It depends on who woke up where, what day, and how they feel that day. So different politicians in the ANC, they just call it whatever they want to call it. There is no such thing as radical economic transformation. It's a farce that is just being utilized for factional politics of the ANC. And to different politicians, it means different things. So I don't know, like whether there can be a successful academic pursuit of something called radical economic transformation, because it doesn't exist. It's just a rhetoric that is meaningless, and it's not even mainstreamed into government policy in terms of what has to be pursued from now on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right, panelists, you have 1 minute each.
I have nothing.
Pandi, nothing. Karen, nothing. Imran.
So let me try to deal with the questions by going back to the metaphor that I started with. I still believe that we can get our economy growing in a way where we could transform South Africa into being something like Sweden. And the kind of lessons that I take from Sweden are, one, that you have a private sector which is disciplined enough to make its investments in the national interest. I can see a public sector that was dramatically efficient, and where public investment was extremely efficient, where kind of ownership was dramatically distributed in a way which changed the ownership sort of patterns in Sweden. But for me, the most important lesson from Sweden is that they had the ability to make really really intelligent choices around around how they drove their economic growth. So what's not well known is that for much of its growth period, what Sweden did is not what's traditionally believed, that they increased wages. In fact, Sweden compressed its wages for large amounts of its growth phase, because it was in the interests of the Swedes to do that. And now, before Fasia tweets that the dean's promoting wage compression in South Africa, I want to be clear that I don't support that. But what I do support is us making intelligent choices around questions of economics, and I think that's something that we have to start with.
Yeah. So I mean, I think the question about ownership, I think, has actually been answered by people here. The only thing I wanted to say is that, firstly, we're the Tambo Memorial events. You know, what they said in the 1969 Strategy and Tactics was specifically to say, we don't want to just change ownership at the top, change the race of the owners. We want to change the structure of the economy to benefit the majority. So I think, of course, capitalism in South Africa and capital is racial in many ways. But if we de-racialize without changing those structures, as people have said, we're not going to get very far. I mean, class aligns with race, but we can address the race issues without fixing the class issues. I don't think you could do the opposite. And there are costs to narrow BEE. I mean, the way it's now structured in mining, we're actually encouraging speculation. Because we're saying you can buy it at the top of the market, and when you start making a loss, you sell out. And yet what we say as government is, no, we want black industrialists, which are people who are actually committed to production and genuinely invested in growing employment and growing the economy and diversifying. And then we incentivize speculation. So I think that it's not so simple just to say we can do both. There are costs to all of these things and trade-offs, and we need to really think about them. And in that context, I think the issue of the accountability of the state is a problem. I don't think it's simple. I think it's a little simple just to say it's because it's semi-privatized. I think we should be saying, what are the decision-making systems that let officials and politicians make decisions that are not in the interest of the majority? Part of that is, as people have pointed out, that the election system assumes that people would be insecure enough they would have to be accountable. And of course that hasn't happened, and it's a little hard to fix if you're not too fond of the opposition parties, but there you go. But also with, elections only happen every few years, and you don't want to just elect a dictator every few years. So we should also be saying, why is it that people in national and provincial departments and even municipalities can be so unaccountable? That it's only when they start being threatened by elections we start hearing about the need for radical economic change. And this is now, you could have a whole other debate on this. Because I think it's quite hard to manage the issue that you want national departments that are powerful enough to restructure the economy, but you want them to be close enough to the people that they actually answer to people's needs. And then one last thing, honestly, I hear what people are saying about radical economic change is an empty slogan, but what it was really about was saying we need to fix the economy. And that I think is actually was an important step forward. But to say we can't just ask people to continue to be patient, we'll fix the schools, we'll fix the healthcare, we know what we're doing there, but the economy continues to be one of the most unequal in the world. That I think that's what it's trying to address, and that's actually something worthwhile.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, I think we should all say thank you to Minister Gigaba, because without him, I think we had a really good debate. I think I'm going to get a clap for that one later. Please thank the panelists, all of whom did, I think, a great job. To our guests, Trevor Manuel, Walid, Max Esulu, the Tambo grandchildren, all of you are invited. There are snacks outside. Please go and eat and be merry. The panelists will mingle, and you can have your questions that I didn't allow you to ask in the hall. Thank you.